I just
think I'm a terrorist.
because of what you say on your shirt.
Just wondering what your office is doing right now to alleviate the siege conditions and the mass starvation in Northern Gaza.
I'm busy. I'm busy.
You're busy?
Yeah, I'm busy. Yeah, yeah. You
Like I
guys
said,
are
I'm
discussing.
sorry-
I
I'm
don't
sorry to
engage with
interrupt.
terrorist sympathizers.
So, what
I
makes you
just
think I'm a terrorist sympathizer?
because of what you say on your shirt when you just asked me. So I've got to go to a meeting. You're a terrorist sympathizer.
Ask about starving children.
What's your shirt say?
Read it. This shows that I'm a terrorist sympathizer, doesn't it?
Because they look. That's very.
With that, I'd like to go to the news updates. Let's start with you, Medea. What's happening on Capitol Hill? I know a lot.
Yeah. Well, first, remember, you can introduce yourselves in the chat. We'll see who's farthest away, and I have a feeling it might be one of our speakers, and that you can use the chat to put your questions in there. Let's see. Well, I'm part of the group that has been going every day to Capitol Hill, and it's a crazy time now. We're going to have the vote tomorrow on the joint resolutions of disapproval introduced by Bernie Sanders. Finally going to have that vote. It was introduced by him with three other co-sponsors, and those are Peter Welsh, Markey, and Schatz. And then we have Van Hollen and Warren who have signed on to it. And we will see tomorrow. It's going to be very exciting. No matter what, we know we're not doing this because we think it's going to pass. We're doing this because we think it's important as a benchmark to see where the senators are, where each of our senators is right now is so important for us as we move forward and keep pushing them to stop sending weapons to Israel. So it's going to be a very, very important vote. This is the first time in U.S. history that there will actually be a vote on limiting some weapons to Israel. So very historic. Stay tuned to see. And of course, that's what we're going to be doing in our action part, right, Marcy? So everybody's.
Yes. Please do stick around. We'll be calling Capitol Hill another time. I know we're all calling every day. I am. I'm sure you are, to say to our U.S. senators co-sponsor these joint resolutions.
Very important that you call. We know that AIPAC has been issuing ads out in 20 different states, and they have their people calling, and we have a lot of people calling. I think we're making more calls than them, but we got to keep it up until the very last minute, which is probably in the afternoon tomorrow. There is another horrible bill right now, and that is over in the House side. That's called HR 9495. And that is a bill that would allow the Treasury Department and now the Trump administration to decide what groups it considers terrorists and take away their nonprofit status, which means basically doing away with them. And it is a very, very dangerous bill that all of the civil rights groups are opposed to. Unfortunately, when it came up for a vote last week, we thought we had defeated it because it didn't get the 2/3 that it needed. Now it's going to come up for a vote again, and they only need a simple majority. Now, last time there were 52 Democrats that voted in favor of this terrible bill, only one Republican who voted the right way, that was Tom Massey. So we have been going to the offices several times of those 52 to say, what is wrong with you? Why are you voting for this horrific bill that would give the Trump administration the opportunity to get rid of whatever groups it wanted to? It certainly will go after groups doing the Palestine work, but they will be able to take out any group they want, environmental groups, Black Lives Matter groups, immigrant rights groups. So anyway, we have a lot of work to do, and that's going to come up for a vote on Thursday. So we've been working hard on that, and we encourage you to also be calling your representative to tell them to vote no on 9495.
Thank you, Medea. And we'll be sending out, Grace often sends out a recap of our Code Pink Congress the next day. So you get all this information tomorrow.
And
Please.
one thing, Marcy, I forgot to say is to please, Grace, if you could post the article that Nicholas Davies and I just wrote about Marco Rubio, 8 reasons why he would be a disastrous Secretary of State. Thank you.
Anybody who's been watching your Instagram videos with Marco Rubio knows what a disaster that guy is. All right, let's thank you so much, Medea, for the news update. And let's get on the phone later tonight in this broadcast to call our U.S. senators one more time. Okay, Hania, you've got some news updates on Trump's picks, yeah?
I mean, as Medea just mentioned, Marco Rubio, what a disaster for such an important position. But as we know, the next 4 years, Marcy, under the potential second Trump administration, could have even more concerning, could be more concerning than the past. His rumored picks for key positions in 2025 underscore a very alarming shift in the U.S. foreign policy priorities. And they focus, I would say, more on loyalty and ideological alignment than on expertise and experience. None of these folks that I'm about to mention here really do have foreign policy experience other than they align ideologically with Donald Trump and the MAGA movement. I would say among the most contentious appointees are Mike Huckabee, slated to be the ambassador to Israel. Despite lacking any diplomatic credentials, his hardline stances, including opposition to ceasefire and Gaza conflict, indicates a very aggressive and one-sided approach to Middle East diplomacy. Another very concerning pick is Elise Stefanik, who's nominated as an ambassador to the United Nations, who similarly lacks experience in terms of diplomacy, but has been a staunch critic of the UN. These selections suggest a very troubling departure from a nuanced international relations, and they raise concerns about how the U.S. will navigate complex global challenges in the next 4 years. Some of the other concerning picks include conservative TV personality and former veteran Pete Hegseth, who is now being considered as the defense secretary pick. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, in 2019, he urged Trump to pardon U.S. service members who had been accused of war crimes. Stephen Witkoff, for example, as the Middle East envoy, and Mike Waltz as national security advisor. Witkoff, a real estate executive with absolutely no diplomatic background, is expected to handle one of the world's most volatile regions. And so it remains to be seen what happens within the next 4 years. Such selections really do highlight the risk of a poorly coordinated, ideologically driven international strategy that could destabilize those regions that are of most concern in the next 4 years. So we shall see, which is, I think, it's really important for us to continue the organizing that we do. So
thank you so much, Hania Jadad Barnes, for that update on Trump's picks. Bizarre. Also included in that group is Tulsi Gabbard. She really stands out as somebody who, at least in the past, has voiced concerns about endless wars. Some people say it's not the war on Gaza she's concerned about, it's regime change wars. We'll see, but she has been nominated by Trump to be the director of national intelligence, overseeing 17, I think, intelligence agencies. Big job. All right, today, CodePink, along with World Beyond War, Veterans for Peace, Progressive Democrats of America's End Wars Working Group, I think I said Veterans for Peace, and the Peace in Ukraine Coalition, which CodePink launched with a number of other organizations after Russia invaded Ukraine, to say we need a ceasefire, we need diplomacy, we don't need nuclear brinkmanship. All of us we issued a press release saying that we denounce President Biden's decision to authorize long-range missile strikes, U.S. missiles, into the heart of Russia. These are the two most nuclear-powered nations, the United States and Russia. What is he thinking? This is another red line that President Biden, or whoever is running the White House, I don't know, has crossed, but we are sounding the alarm. Unfortunately, I just read in The Hill that most Democrats and Republicans are fully behind this. So we need a wake-up call on Capitol Hill. Apparently, 6 missiles were shot today in a pre-dawn raid from Ukraine. And again, these are U.S. missiles. So another campaign, right? You can see the press release on the CodePink website. With that, let's introduce our guests. We have 2 guests tonight, wonderful guests. We have Antony Lowenstein, who is the author of The Palestine Laboratory and just launched a web podcast by the same name. And we have Nora Lester-Murad, who has become a good friend in a short time. And she is one of the key organizers of Drop the ADL from Our Schools. First, let's go to Medea to introduce Antony.
Well, Antony has already won the contest for coming to us from the farthest away tonight. Antony Lowenstein is an Australian-German investigative journalist, podcaster, and best-selling author of The Palestine Laboratory: How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World. Lowenstein is the co-editor of After Zionism, a collection of the world's leading writers and thinkers who outline how the one-state solution can be achieved in the Middle East. His other books include Pills, Powder, and Smoke, Disaster Capitalism, and My Israel Question. He also has made some wonderful documentary films. He lives now in Sydney, Australia, but was based in East Jerusalem from 2016 to 2020 and visited Gaza several times. Thank you so much, Antony, for joining us. Except you're muted.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Yes, wonderful. Medea, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you, CodePink, for having me. It's really wonderful to be here. I may be very, very, very far away. It's actually Wednesday here at lunchtime, so I'm in a whole different day, different time zone. But I wanted to say maybe a few things, a bit about what the book's about, what the podcast is about, but just the broader issues about the Israeli arms industry, which I think often gets ignored in this conversation, that we so often talk about the US supporting Israel and giving them unlimited amounts of money and weapons. All that is basically true, but it's only part of the picture. This book they wrote came out last year called The Palestine Laboratory, and the podcast, which we just released with Dropsite News, which is a relatively new investigative website launched by certain so-called refugees from The Intercept. You can find this all your podcast platforms, Spotify, etc. Essentially is looking at how Israel, pretty much from its birth in 1948, and it's accelerated after 1967, the Six-Day War, has really used Palestinians as guinea pigs, essentially, to test a whole range of weapons and surveillance tech, and then sell those and market those to countless nations around the world. We're talking about, we don't actually even know, really, how many nations Israel has sold weapons to in the last half century plus. I estimate anywhere between 125 and 140, so essentially the majority of nations on the planet. And we're talking in the modern age about spyware, biometric tools, drones, including quadcopters, killer drones, something we've seen Israel using in Gaza since October 7. And the book, in some ways, and the podcast too, although they're obviously different, I'm also working on a film on this issue, which hopefully will be out soon, so look out for that in the coming months, is really, I guess, challenging 2 things. One, there's so much knowledge, I think, especially on the left, and I'm sure in this crowd here, of US support for dictatorships around the world since World War II. Pretty much any repressive state, Washington has backed it. What is far less known is that Israel was often doing exactly the same thing, either with the US or separately. So we're talking about everything from apartheid South Africa during its worst years of oppression, to the genocidal regime in Guatemala in the 80s, to the Iranian regime before 1979. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, and the book details that. And then in the modern era, I explain how Israel in some ways has successfully weaponized 9/11. And 9/11 obviously happened in the US, not Israel. But Israel sold itself as a solution to the world's paranoia or fears, often created fears. And the Israeli arms industry, for a relatively tiny country, Israel has about the 9th biggest arms industry in the world. In 2023, which is the latest figures that we have, Israel sold around 13.1 billion US dollars, which is massive. Now, the US is number one. The US is number one arms dealer in the world and sells about 45% of the world's weapons. And the US arms industry, in fact, the global arms industry is soaring because of the war in Gaza, because of the war in Ukraine, because of many reasons. And I fear that'll continue under Trump, if not worsen. But the fact that Israel is the ninth biggest arms dealer in the world for a relatively small country is so often not explained. And it's a lot to do with the fact that Israel has used Palestine not just as a testing ground, but also, I would argue, as an insurance policy, that when many, many nations after the Six-Day War in 1967 were really upset publicly and privately about what Israel was doing, this is really right at the beginning of the occupation. Israel would often promote itself as the solution to other countries' problems. So what I mean by that is country X would come to Israel, or Israel would go to them and say, we would want to deal with our minority problem, our Muslims, our whoever it may be that we don't like, our dissidents, our journalists. Can you help us? And Israel was very happy to do so. That's how they made friends, so to speak. And in the modern era, we're talking about everyone from, including to this day, by the way, Myanmar, after the UN found that it had committed genocide in the last decade, much of the Arab world, because it's worth saying, since October 7, note, not one Arab state has cut ties with Israel, not one. Now, they've been critical, they've expressed their disquiet, their anguish. No one's cut ties, and no one will. Because I'm not talking about here Arab people, I'm talking about Arab leaders, whether it's Saudi, Jordan, Egypt, etc. Firstly, most of them have contempt for Palestinians and have for decades. Secondly, they very much privately support Israel's goals, which is attempting to destroy Hamas and Hezbollah, which they won't succeed in, but that's what they're claiming they want to do. They have no issue really with Israeli occupation and dehumanization of Palestinians. Many of these nations in the Arab world see their future success as going to Washington via Israel. And I explain in the book that in the last really 10 years, although it's been existing longer than that, many Arab states have bought some of Israel's most sophisticated spyware and weapons. Why? Because they're petrified of Arab Spring 2.0. They're petrified of their own people rising up, essentially. So they're using so-called world's best Israeli spyware. Now, I think maybe I should stop in a minute, Marcy, and take questions. I don't want to speak too long. I can speak longer if you'd like, but
Sure. Well, we do have a few questions.
yeah, please. Why don't we do questions? Anyway, that's the summary, and yeah, much more to say.
Okay. So the first question is Israel selling weapons they themselves produce or reselling the weapons they get from the US? Where are these weapons coming from?
The short answer is both. Israel makes a lot of its own weapons. Israel has very successful, profitable arms industries, companies, Elbit, Rafael, and others, whose profits are soaring, by the way, since October 7. And so sometimes they're producing their own weapons or surveillance tech in Israel. But of course, as many people on this call will know, so much of the US so-called aid that goes to Israel is partly to assist in the weapons industry. So the answer is both. And the only way this would ever really stop, in my view, because it's not going to come initially from the US, sadly, is countries imposing arms embargoes. And that's so far as a few nations since October 7 have said they'll no longer buy weapons or surveillance tech. The country that comes to mind is Colombia. There are others. And that needs to be far deeper than what we've had so far. And I can't think of any other nations, happy to be corrected on this, that have come out and said in the last 13 or so months, we will no longer buy Israeli tech. Because just finally on this point, a lot of nations that are expressing anger with what Israel's doing in Gaza and Lebanon, believe me, actually are excited about it and want to buy the weapons and the tech that Israel's using in Gaza and Lebanon for themselves. I know this because I've spoken to some of them and I've seen them talking about the global arms fairs. That's some of the work that I've done investigating it. So, as I often say, look at what people do rather than what they say, or countries, I should say.
Thank you, Anthony. And while we're asking you questions and engaging in this dialogue, Grace, if you could please bring Robert Jureski in, because he is our a coordinator of the UN World Court team, and he may have some other thoughts about the response they've been getting at the United Nations. So, Medea, question.
Well, there are questions in the chat of people wanting to know in about the contempt you said that the Arab states have for Palestinians, and what do you mean by that?
When I say that, to be clear, I'm not talking about the majority of Arab people in the Arab world. I'm talking about Arab leaders and Arab elites. In the last years, and this, of course, was happening before Trump was president, obviously Trump put in place the so-called Abraham Accords, which was this, frankly, it was an arms deal, which was sold as a normalization deal between Israel and a handful of Arab states. Trump will certainly try to continue that with a deal between Israel, the US, and Saudi. What I mean by that is that over the decades, long before October 7, long before 9/11, some Arab states have undeniably taken in certain Palestinians. Lebanon has, Egypt has, Jordan has. But if you ask, as I have and spent a lot of time in those countries, Palestinians are treated as second-class citizens at best in all those countries. Since October 7, very, very few Arab states have taken any Palestinians at all. Yes, Egypt has taken quite a few, but let's be clear what that is. The system that allowed Palestinians to leave Gaza to get into Egypt required essentially paying bribes to an Egyptian company, which was backed by the state, to allow Palestinians to escape the genocide and go into Egypt. The Palestinians that currently are in Egypt, there are tens of thousands of them, are in permanent limbo. They can't work legally. They can't send their kids to school. I have Palestinian friends who are in that situation right now. In the broader sense, since October 7, no Arab state has cut ties, not one. So what I'm saying is that there needs to be, and of course, if you ask the majority of Arab people in their countries what they think about Israel normalization, Palestinians, in the majority of cases, this is based on polling, they say they don't support their countries normalizing relations with Israel. This is also the case in Egypt and Jordan. The only reason Egypt and Jordan remain so-called friends with Israel is the US gives them aid, a bribe, every year. It's the only reason. It's the only reason that they're still friends with Israel. So what I say in all these relationships are surface deep. That, yes, Arab elites have a reason. If you ask a lot of high-tech Arab leaders in Dubai, they're excited about the fact that they can go to Israel. Israelis like going to Dubai for holiday. They're selling a lot of high-tech weapons and surveillance tech to each other. Fine. That's not the majority of people in those countries. So what's what I mean, that there is contempt by many in the Arab elites towards Palestinians. It has been for decades, and it's shameful.
Hania.
Thank you so much, Anthony. One thing that's really interesting is that, as you know already, during the Iran-Iraq War, Israel was also discreetly supplying Iran with weapons and spare parts that were left over from Shah's era. So a really interesting question that came up in the chat is, should the U.S. stop sending arms to Israel? Would Israel have enough weapons to continue the war and genocide against Gaza and Palestinians?
I mean, the short answer is America should stop it yesterday. So yes. Would the war stop tomorrow if the US stopped selling weapons? No. However, Israel cannot conduct its wars in Lebanon and Gaza and elsewhere without US weapons. It's not just about weapons, it's also logistics, diplomatic support, political support. So the short answer is the war wouldn't stop the next day, but it would stop pretty damn soon. Israel knows that, which is why throughout this whole 13-month process, as everyone on this call would probably know, there's never really been any interest on the US side to stop that weapons flow. There hasn't. There's been certain officials, as we read, who have resigned, who have been very critical, and I give them plaudits for doing so. But the US military and political establishment has been very happy to continue selling weapons and will continue to do so. So yes, I guess the short answer is it would make a massive difference if the US stopped selling them, as it would, by the way, if Germany would. And Germany is the second biggest provider of weapons after Israel, after the US.
Anthony, at this point, I'd like to bring in Robert Jureski to the conversation.
Robert.
Head of our UN team in New York City, has been in front of various missions for a year now and meeting with representatives and ambassadors urging first support for South Africa at the International Court of Justice in its case against Israel for genocide, and now recently urging a complete trade embargo, arms, tech, fuel. So, Robert, bring us up to date about what's happening at the United Nations.
Sure. Well, thanks a lot for having this discussion and for wanting to hear about this. Our efforts in New York are because we have the UN headquarters here, and because of that, we can reach into the foreign ministries of countries all over the world, ones that are supposedly friendly, like Turkey and Brazil, and ones that are not so friendly, like Germany and well, the United States. We just recently, what's happening at the UN recently is that we held demonstrations in solidarity with Turkish activists who have been blocking ports, taking over ships, going to offices of the company Sokar, because there's supposedly Erdogan, an enemy of Israel, has been declaring that there's a trade embargo against Israel because of what Israel's doing to the Palestinians. And that was announced in May, but Turkish journalists have exposed this as a lie. And Turkey has a very powerful role to play in the ongoing wanton murder of Palestinians because of all the oil that passes through Turkish territory from Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, where Erdogan, would he really want to stop Israel, could threaten to cut that off. It's a Turkish pipeline, and it goes to Ceyhan and then by ship to Israel. So
what about this week?
What's that? That was earlier this week, these demonstrations in solidarity with Turkish activists who have been demonstrating in cities across Turkey, also in Japan. There have been demonstrations in Croatia, Austria, Switzerland, Germany, about, well, exposing this hypocrisy and trying to get Erdogan to respond to his people and to world opinion, which is disgusted by what Israel's doing. Later this week, we're going to be going to the German mission to the UN and demonstrating there. They recently passed a bill in Parliament, again, equating Zionism with Judaism, and so trying to silence criticism of Israel's brutal policy. So there are going to be anti-Zionist religious Jews. There are going to be, secular Jews. There are going to be lots of activists in New York who oppose what Israel's doing. We have met with other missions. We try to have people participate who have a history with the country, either origins or friends or some kind of business relationship, something to tie into the country we're meeting with. If folks on this call have people in New York with relations to key countries, Brazil still trading with Israel, South Africa also, unfortunately, sending coal, selling coal. If you have relations with countries in Europe, we'd like to get the EU's the biggest trading partner of Israel, and economic sanctions against Israel by the EU would be devastating. So it would be great if you would contact our project, the World Court Campaign, CodePink's World Court Campaign. You can, I'll put in the chat how to reach us. And thanks a lot.
Thank you. And thank you for being in front of the US mission as well this week.
Yeah,